Hello and welcome to another episode of Reviews Redux, where I take another look at one of my older reviews and bring it up to my more current quality standards. Today I'm taking another look at Call of Duty Black Ops for PC, Mac, Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, Wii, and Nintendo DS. What you're seeing here is of course the PC version. This is a first-person shooter, the sequel to Call of Duty World at War, and the 7th main entry in the Call of Duty series. It was developed by Treyarch and published by Activision in 2010 for most of the platforms, although it didn't see a Mac release until 2012. And it went on to break the sales records set by Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 by a fairly considerable margin, and has gone on to become the progenitor of a rather long-lived sub-series within the Call of Duty series itself, with Black Ops now being up to 4, and supposedly the 5th Black Ops game being in development currently. Generally, it was pretty well received, although the PC version did have numerous complaints on launch with a lot of technical problems that have since been mostly sorted out, although you will still occasionally run into some glitches here and there, and it's not an optimal PC release because all of the PC-specific features they brought up really only apply to the multiplayer portion of the game and not for the single-player or the zombies mode. So, for example, if you want to increase your FOV above the 65 degrees that induces heavy nausea in a lot of people, then you're just kind of SOL unless you only play the multiplayer, which does allow you to go up to 90 degrees. So that's definitely disappointing as far as the PC version goes, but what about the game in general? How does it stack up as far as the rest of the Call of Duty series is concerned? How does it work as a sequel to Call of Duty World at War, and more importantly as a follow-up to Modern Warfare 2? And how is it as a first-person shooter in general? Well, let's go ahead and start delving right into it and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which I'm mostly going to compare to World at War, actually, because comparing it to Modern Warfare 2 is certainly reasonable in terms of visual quality, and it's about the same as that, maybe very slight improvements here and there, but it's really better to compare it to World at War because the games have practically the same art style, which means that it is, of course,
of the persuasion of terracotta with accents of slate, comprising a natural visage.
I mean, seriously, just look at it. Even when the game does have colors other than brown and gray, it's mostly either red or some very muted tones. And I get why they're going for that in some cases. I mean, the Soviet bloc was not particularly colorful when you're in regions that were controlled by the Soviets. But even aside from that, it just has no vibrancy whatsoever. All of the interesting parts of the visuals really come from just the sheer amount of detail they've packed into the levels themselves more than anything else, as well as the occasional spectacle moment. As far as raw visual quality goes, everything is rather solid for its time. I mean, it has solid modeling and animation, although some of the animations are definitely reused from previous Call of Duty games, even going back to Call of Duty 4. So that is mildly disappointing, but at least the animations they do reuse work pretty well, so it's not a massive problem. And of course, there is the matter of this being an Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 generation first-person shooter, so the texture quality is not going to be particularly great across the board, although they definitely did what they could with what they had here, and the PC version does definitely look better than the console version does. Of course, you gotta keep in mind as well that there were definitely better looking games out there by the time this released. I mean, Battlefield Bad Company 2 came out in March of the same year and looks leagues ahead of this, and of course the following year you had the release of Battlefield 3, but that's more for the Modern Warfare 3 Redux. But the point is that the engine was really starting to show its age as of Black Ops, and that would only continue until they finally moved over to the next gen of consoles and they really started to look at overhauling the engine in its entirety. But then you move over into the sound design, and that's where things get even messier for the presentation. I mean, don't get me wrong, the voice acting in the game is generally quite excellent, although Mason himself is voiced by an Australian, which is an odd thing for an American character to be, so occasionally that Australian accent comes through and he just sounds kind of ridiculous. But the rest of the cast definitely works out in the game's favor. I mean, you've got Gary Oldman returning to voice Reznov again, so how can you not love that? And you've even got Ed Harris voicing Hudson, so they've definitely done a very good job with selecting the voice cast, and they've done a very good job with directing it as well. Then you move over into the soundtrack, which is done by Sean Murray, and it's also quite excellent. And the thing is that unlike in World at War, where there was that weird tonal issue with the soundtrack making you out to be this ultra badass and making everything you were doing out to be super cool, while the game itself was trying to do the whole horrors of war thing and make everything out to be deadly serious, except in the Russian campaign anyway, resulting in the bizarre tonal dissonance that made the American campaign just feel completely at odds with itself and the Russian campaign just kinda silly. Black Ops doesn't really have that problem, because the tone of the game is considerably less serious and a hell of a lot more pulp action thriller than it is anything else, so it actually ends up fitting the game a hell of a lot better to have these badass guitar riffs and such. So the soundtrack actually ends up being a boon for the game as opposed to this just kinda odd detriment. But then there are the sound effects, which are what ultimately make the sound design a very mixed bag at best. And that's because the explosions are dull and lifeless and have absolutely no impact behind them, and the gunfire itself just doesn't really sound like guns for the most part. This is a problem that Treyarch has had since the beginning of their time with the Call of Duty series. For some baffling reason, they just can't seem to get it through their heads that gunfire and explosions need to be nice and beefy and not sound like you just took some random household objects and tried to make gun sound effects out of them. That just ends up making the action a lot less satisfying, and that's exactly what happens with the sound effects in this. It's a real shame, because otherwise the presentation is rather solid for the most part. It's just that one thing drags it down pretty considerably. But of course what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you primarily play as Alex Mason, who is a Special Forces operative, but occasionally your perspective will shift to other characters as well. And the vast majority of the game is spent going back into past operations as part of an interrogation sequence that the game starts out on, where the interrogators are asking Mason about the numbers. What do the numbers mean, Mason? Well, the answer to that question is revealed over the course of going back through Mason's previous operations, and even some operations that weren't his, so you can get the full context of the plot from multiple angles, because Mason's are actually quite unreliable. When you go through his story, you're seeing it from his perspective, but what he's seeing isn't necessarily what's there. And I'm just gonna leave it at that, because the story is actually one of the most interesting parts of the game, not necessarily because it's particularly well written or anything, because a lot of the fun of the campaign is actually not necessarily knowing exactly what's going on and not having the full context, and having that gradually revealed to you over time so you can kind of piece together exactly what's happening before the game does do its big reveal. It's a storytelling method that broke new ground for the Call of Duty franchise, and they actually did it rather well with this first entry, even though the story itself is admittedly pretty ridiculous and is really just meant to be this kind of over-the-top action thriller that's not really meant to be taken all that seriously. And of course, it being set during the 60s and 70s, there's all kinds of room for plausible deniability operations, which is the name of the game for the Cold War. And they definitely give you some nice variety here, starting with the first level, which is set during the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, and going all the way over into the heart of Siberia, or during the Vietnam War during the Siege of Khe Sanh, or even fighting your way across the rooftops of Kowloon City. It's a globetrotting adventure, and it really does feel like an adventure. Although, in typical Treyarch fashion, it does have its really bizarre fascination with gore, carnage, and brutality. And there's one particular scene which is just a bit uncomfortable because there's not really too much reason to make it interactive. But for whatever reason, Treyarch decided that it would be air quotes fun to break some glass off of a window, shove it in someone's mouth, and then start punching them repeatedly in the face. I mean, this is at the very beginning of a level, and it may as well just be a cutscene because you can't get out of it, so there's not much reason to make it interactive. And it's just one of those things that make you look at Treyarch and go, what the hell is wrong with you people? But aside from that one particular oddity, the rest of the campaign is an action-packed thrill ride, and it's in typical Call of Duty fashion for that era, a rather solid campaign that will keep you entertained for several hours. And in hindsight, it's one of the better campaigns in the entire Call of Duty series. It's just a shame that the entire thing is at 65-degree FOV, so it can become rather nauseous to play it. But if you can put up with that, the campaign is worth the price of admission alone, although I would say that what they've got it priced at right now is pretty ridiculous. I mean, it's still $40 9 years later. That's just absurd. But it does go on sale pretty often, and if you can get it on sale, then the campaign's worth the price of admission alone. But of course, the single player is only one component of the game. There's still 2 other modes of play available, which are the Zombies mode, which is typical for Treyarch, and the multiplayer mode, which is the kind of standard Call of Duty multiplayer fare. I'll start with the Zombies because I don't really have much to say about it. If you've played the Zombies mode in Call of Duty World at War, this is going to be very familiar to you, although it is expanded upon. They've added additional maps, they've added some additional content, and of course you do have all of the weaponry from Black Ops itself, but there's also an additional secret level that you unlock if you play through the entire campaign, where you'll be fighting off hordes of zombies as either John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon, Robert McNamara, or Fidel Castro, and that is about as ridiculous and silly as that sounds. As for the mode itself, if you're not familiar with it, it's just a wave-based mode. You fight off waves of zombies by getting different weapons that you unlock by getting points from killing zombies, or from reinforcing windows, and you can spend those points to get different equipment, as well as power-ups and things like that. Occasionally a zombie will drop a power-up that will be things like double points, or a power-up that just kills all the zombies on the map right then and there, or something along those lines. And it's just a silly co-op arcade mode that was particularly popular in World at War, so they decided to bring it back for Black Ops. I don't get much of anything out of it because zombies bore the living crap out of me, but your mileage may vary. Then, of course, there's the actual multiplayer, which is where a large portion of the changes were made compared to Modern Warfare 2. Everything that had come to define Call of Duty multiplayer post Call of Duty 4 is all present and accounted for. It still has all the same modes, you still have the create a class system, there are still perks and kill streaks and that sort of thing, but they also introduced a few new features. First, they introduced the ability to make custom emblems and either stick those on your weapons themselves, or just have them as part of your player card and nothing more. It just depends on what you want to unlock for the weapons themselves. And they also introduced a currency system where you earn the currency as you continue to play through the game, and you unlock achievements, and you just win matches or even lose matches and things like that. And you can spend that to unlock weapons or weapon attachments or anything along those lines. And unlike in other Call of Duty games where you have to level up your weapons in order to get the different skins and the different attachments, all you have to do in Black Ops is reach the appropriate player level to unlock the ability to purchase a perk or a weapon. Once you've purchased a weapon, then you can actually go through any of the attachments as you desire. If there's a particular attachment you want, you don't have to grind for it, you just buy it with the currency. And that is greatly refreshing, although I really wish that they didn't have the level-based unlocks for the weapons and perks themselves, and just made everything part of the currency system, so you can just go in and pick exactly what you want right from the beginning. Instead, we get this kind of weird hybrid system from older Call of Duties and this new currency system, which unfortunately was only used for this one game. They never used a currency system again, although they did use unlock tokens in Black Ops 2, which was a bit messy. But anyway, the point there is that it's a missed opportunity. They very easily could have just done that with the rest of the games going forward, and it would have actually made the Create a Class system a lot better as a whole if they just dropped the level-based unlocks entirely and just went over to a true a la carte unlock system. It's a bit of a shame, really. But aside from the overhaul to the unlock system, they also made a fair few other changes to the multiplayer. Obviously, they introduced some new modes of play, like Sticks and Stones, or One in the Chamber, or Gun Game, all of which are definitely nice additions, but they're not the kind of thing that's going to keep you occupied for a particularly long time. And then there's also an additional mode called Combat Training, where you can play against bots, which is a really nice feature, and that's actually what you've been seeing in its entirety as far as the multiplayer footage is concerned, because you pretty much can't find people playing this thing except at really certain hours, and I was never up and working on this during those hours, so I could never really find any games. The bots don't really put up much of a challenge unless you put them on at the very least hardened or especially veteran difficulty, but even then the challenge is mostly going to be the fact that they have pinpoint accuracy and they know exactly where you are at all times, so they just basically cheat at that point. But it's nice to just have a game with bot support at all, so you can go in and you can test out different loadouts and see how they work and what doesn't work, and just tailor your own loadouts in the actual multiplayer to match. The only real problem there is that the combat training mode has its own individual progression, so you have to earn the in-game currency separately for that and spend it accordingly. It just ends up being a bit of a mess. But with bot matches not really being much of a thing, especially not on PC by the time this launched, that's just a nice feature to have in general anyway. And then of course there are the elephants in the room, which are all the PC exclusive features, which are something that were a direct response to the pretty negative reception that Modern Warfare 2 had on PC, where it was an obvious console port with peer-to-peer and matchmaking, a locked 65-degree FOV, and it just was a mess on the technical side of things. Black Ops, on the other hand, does have matchmaking as an option, but if you don't want to use that, you can just hop into the server browser and join any of the dedicated servers that are hosted by the community. I mean, sure, there's not really much in the way of mod support, but hey, it has dedicated servers and a server browser, and they work rather well. It means that you have much more stable connections, you don't have a host advantage, and you can quite easily carve out your own space within the Call of Duty Black Ops community. It's a very nice thing that, sadly, they haven't continued from here on out. The last game in the series to feature dedicated community servers with a server browser was Modern Warfare 3, and you had to specifically go and enable that in the options menu to just see the server browser at all, so most people didn't even know it was a thing. Black Ops was the last one to feature that on the main menu by default as really the primary method of joining a game. And on top of that, they even put in the old school leaning mechanic where you could use Q and E by default to actually lean left or right and just kind of poke yourself out around corners. You can certainly make the argument that certain other games in the series later on did have the ability to lean around corners, but that was a context-sensitive thing instead of an actual button that you press dedicated to leaning left or right, so this was really the last of the truly old-school Call of Duty games. And they did certainly go out of their way to try to address a lot of the community concerns after having played Modern Warfare 2. While the kill streaks are still pretty overpowered, the weapons themselves have been much better balanced. Most of them have a fair bit of recoil to them, although some of them less so. The Sleight of Hand Pro perk doesn't even apply to sniper rifles at all, so you can't just get that speed boost to aiming down your sights with a sniper rifle anymore, and you have to actually hard scope as opposed to quick scoping all the time. It sounds stupid to say those terms, but that's beside the point. And that was one of the biggest problems people had with the previous game in the series, because quickscoping was definitely a plague in Modern Warfare 2, if you played it on console. See, the reason that quickscoping was ever a problem is because console has aim assist, and if you quickscope with the aim assist, then you're pretty much guaranteed an instant hit. That's not a problem on PC, because PC does not have aim assist. So it never really applied to PC in the first place, but hey, it's a thing that's there for the console players if that was a problem for them. And they even tried to give the game a bit more mobility by giving you an additional diving mechanic, where if you're sprinting and you press the button for prone, then you dive forward and land in the prone position with a very brief period where you can't shoot at anything, but it's pretty decent for either getting out of the way of shots or diving through a window or something along those lines. And when you bring everything together, you find that this was really the game that made Treyarch stand shoulder to shoulder with Infinity Ward as far as the quality of the Call of Duty series goes. They really stepped up their game here and put out something that was rather reminiscent of what Infinity Ward had been doing up to that point, and more importantly, they actually set themselves apart as listening to the community and taking the proper feedback from it. They looked at what went wrong with Modern Warfare 2 and tried to rectify it. Did it always work? Not always in the best way, but generally speaking, they did what they could, and it worked out mostly pretty well. And on the PC side of things, they listened to the PC gaming community and said, okay, let's actually make a proper PC version. And even though there were a lot of technical problems on the game's launch, it ultimately ended up being a rather strong PC version apart from the single player and the zombies mode, where you have that locked 65-degree FOV. But unfortunately, as solid as Black Ops is, it's also the last hurrah for the Call of Duty 4 era. When you look at the way the series progressed from then on out, it declined very significantly in quality leading up to today, and they ultimately just never really managed to fully recapture what made Call of Duty 4, and to a lesser degree Black Ops, so enjoyable. And I guess to an even lesser degree Modern Warfare 2, if that game had actually been treated properly on PC anyway. But even though the series as a whole has been collapsing in on itself since this game's release, thankfully Treyarch's effort did not go unrewarded, because Black Ops itself is still an excellent game to this day. I still give it a 4 out of 5. Thanks for watching.